if my income is, or my potential income is capped at 2.5%, yet my property taxes are going up, my cost of recycling and garbage is going up, my cost of hydro is going up. Not right now, but sooner than later, my interest rates are going to go up if I'm carrying a mortgage. Why am I going to invest into a property where I have a restricted income increase of 2.5%, but my bottom line might be going up by 5 or 6%?
Welcome to episode 21 of the Crownsman podcast. How are you, Gowdy? What's funny?
I'm good.
You're already laughing.
I am. I think it's great. We're on episode 21.
Yeah, we're in the
Time
20s
flies.
now. Yeah, time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah.
And I was reading an interesting stat yesterday that I'm going to try to read this out. This is in 2018 December. That 76% of people's wealth was in real estate in Canada. Now, this is not the U.S. We have a lot of viewers south to our neighbors to the south. This is a Canadian stat. But if the Canadian wealth is over 11 trillion, over 8 trillion of that is in property. So, of course, we realized if we're going to have a show, about heavy industry. Anything that we talk about, property is such a central part of it.
Yeah.
So we had to get someone who was an expert on it and to come in. So we
Yes.
have Cory Wright from Cory Wright from William and Wright. I
William Wright
butchered.
commercial, yeah.
Yeah, butchered that. You know what? When I butcher that, I have to say it about 3 more times to correct it, so you actually get more exposure.
It's perfect. That's why we're here.
Before we get into the show, Gowdy, can
Yes.
you talk about our sponsors who keep this show rolling along?
Yes, of course. And we couldn't do anything without our sponsors. So, first off, we have Streamline. Streamline, they offer a complete package of fleet management solutions with 3 incredible products. Number 1, NaviStream, their onboard intelligence and telematics system. NaviLink, their vehicle automation and IoT platform, and Dagama, their dynamic transportation management system. And you can visit stti.com for their Streamline Advantage.
And they were a guest on the show.
They were a guest.
Yeah, look
yes.
them up. It's a good episode. Lots of
Yeah.
information.
And don't forget, if you want to sponsor or be a guest, you can email us at info@crownsman.com.
That's right.
Just throw that in there.
Just throw that in there. Oh, you're really in the sales mode this morning. That's why you're laughing. You're after
Maybe.
people.
We also have Resource World, and that's they are a Resource World magazine. Sorry, they report on the business of mining, oil and gas, green technologies, and the events that affect these sectors. And you can catch their February, March. Actually, I think they have a May issue coming out, and see the latest news at resourceworld.com. Yeah,
Cool. All right.
I'm good now.
Let's get into it. Well, how's it going, Cory?
Good.
Good.
Thanks so much for having us this morning. We appreciate it.
Yeah, we're excited to have you because, like I said at the beginning of the show, and I hope these stats. This is from Global News, so I think the stats are accurate. And
I'd hope so if they're reporting that.
yeah, I would hope so. So it's every single person that we've had on this show. A couple episodes we did the similar thing with banking. We had someone come in who was sort of expert on getting finance, Brad Kindle. And we got a good response to that interview, too. Oh, trying to get the screen on?
I'm sorry. Please continue.
No
I know.
worries.
That's why. Kate here.
And people found that really helpful because, the technology people love, the engineers and the
For sure.
executives love watching that. But the real estate is such a big cost to a lot of these companies
sure.
that are
It's a huge
operating.
cost.
So I wanted to unpackage things. We'll start with the industrial side of it.
Sure.
Because a lot of our viewers are that, and then move into some of the other stuff
Sounds good.
later on. So you mentioned yesterday we had a quick call on the phone about zoning and rezoning. It's happening a lot in the industrial zoned areas.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I think right now, like every municipality and city, they're struggling to create housing opportunities. And when you look at what we call OCPs, or official community plans, cities will look at areas that they can potentially add more density to them.
Yeah.
And when you look at the typical industrial areas, you might have 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 square foot lots or yards with very, very small buildings attached to them, 3,000, 5,000 or whatever. And the cities can look at those opportunities. And if you can take a 20,000 or a 30,000 square foot site potentially, create a tower opportunity or a mid-rise opportunity on there, you may be able to put 300 condos. So when cities are looking for areas to increase density, it's very easy for them to look into these industrial areas where there's large plots of land that they can take, half a dozen or a dozen buildings, and you can put in a dozen towers. So what's happening right now in the industrial sector, and industrial is an extremely hot product, whether you're a landlord or you're leasing your property or you're trying to acquire land in that area, is the industrial opportunities are shrinking for tenants and buyers because cities are rezoning them, and a lot of these opportunities that are there now may not exist 10 years down the road. And when you look at areas like Hastings Street or Franklin and that stuff in the Vancouver marketplace, all these old, not really decrepit, but really old warehouses that sit on these large plots of land are all have rezoning opportunity under the OCP that came out last year, where now you can put up 6-story wood frame construction or 6-story wood frame multifamily, all that stuff. So this land is slowly starting to disappear, yet the industrial sector is getting bigger. So you have more demand on the tenant side of things, and then the industrial zoning that's there now, a lot of these smaller small bay industrial products that are getting built, the zonings are so much more flexible. You go back 10 years, the zoning the tenant opportunities was sort of light manufacturing and stuff like that. And now you're seeing law firms, you're seeing accounting firms. So the zonings are becoming so much more flexible and allowing for so many more tenant opportunities. So you have almost a perfect storm from a landlord position, because you have shrinking supply and demand is increasing, which in turn, in Vancouver alone, Metro Vancouver, they've seen some of the industrial lease rates climb 30% in 2 years, which when they go to sell these products at a later date, they sell on a capitalization rate, which is determined based on the income of the property, that you're seeing 20-30% increases in these properties in a short period of time.
Is the rezoning, are the rezoning applications but the cities are pushing for them as well?
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when the rezoning application, that's coming from a business or an individual who
Correct.
wants to rezone.
Correct.
Is it, I'm sure it's a mixture, but is it typically from the owner of the property, or is it someone who wants to buy and then they come in? And
Well, what you're seeing is, like, if you look at some of these areas where, if you look at, say, the Cambie corridor and stuff like that, where you have these old houses and then developers are buying them to put up multifamily properties, is a lot of time the applications are made to the city, typically through like an architect that's hired on behalf of the developer, who's buying it, who puts it forward. And one of the challenges from a developing standpoint nowadays is one of the largest costs these developers have is land acquisition costs. After I acquire the land, sometimes it might take me 2 years before I actually get a shovel in the ground to start this process. So there's a lot of carrying costs that take place. So a lot of times you're seeing the long closings where it's maybe a year, sometimes even 2-year closings now, we've heard of, that developers will do that. The architect will put forward the application to the city. Usually the land still might be owned by the original owner. It hasn't been closed on yet. And then that process takes place with the city. And usually the architects will spearhead that. And that's all a derivative of what the OCP says you can put in those properties.
How far out is the rezoning going? Like, if you move out into the more rural areas, are there as many applications for that, or is this happening more within, high density areas?
Well, I think if you look at it from like a housing perspective, and I think if you take a pebble and you drop it in the water, and the biggest ripples would obviously be in Vancouver, and then it slowly gets further and further out. I think what's happening is you're seeing cities like Langley and all that stuff having to look at these opportunities now, because people are getting pushed into these valley markets whether they want to or not. And I think if you go back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and someone was a young professional and you gave them $1 million, they wouldn't be telling you they'd be buying a townhouse. They'd be building a mansion, right? And that just doesn't exist anymore. So for people to be able to afford housing opportunities, or people who want to get into housing that are done with the rental market, say in Vancouver, they're having to look at areas like Langley, Abbotsford, even Chilliwack now. They've seen huge growth in the past couple of years, just because people want to be in the home ownership game. And that's really where a lot of people are having to go, just based on affordability. So areas like Chilliwack, New West, Old Sapperton area, all these things are now being reconsidered from old industrial sites to maybe waterfront development opportunities.
Right. And is that going even past New West, like places like an Abbotsford and that?
For sure.
Are they're rezoning that as well?
You're seeing it. You're seeing cities that are taking a look at all this stuff now, and things like Abbotsford, for example, which we do a lot of work in that area. You're seeing these huge population increases year over year, kind of kicking in now, because people are wanting to get into the housing ownership, and this is where they're having to look. If they have 400,000 or 500,000 for a townhouse, they're having to look in Langley, Abbotsford, Mission area now, where 5 years ago maybe you didn't have to. So they're looking at it there, and obviously these municipalities want to create more family-like atmospheres, and they're looking at how they can create opportunities. So industrial stuff in those areas are definitely being considered. Or if you look at the Coquitlam area, like the Burke Mountain District, which has sort of been over a 9-year program to date. I mean, all these forestry areas are all turning into sort of family opportunities now. So cities are forced to have to look at this stuff because the population is coming, whether they're really prepared for it or not.
Yeah. Are people so? How much of it are you seeing that people are buying? The transactions are actually for an owner operator. They're coming in. They're buying their commercial property to put equipment on,
Yeah.
open a manufacturing
For
plant.
sure.
Are you seeing that, or is a lot of those sort of operations, are they now leasing now as opposed to buying?
Well, to be honest with you, so over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of good programs rolled out by banks to help create owner-occupier opportunities. And like BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada, they're the forefront of this, and they're really working hard to try to get business owners into land as well. And if you look at sort of the small bay industrial, and we talk about small bay, we're talking sort of 1,500 square feet to 2,500 square feet strata, industrial strata lots with grade level loading doors. That has the largest percentage of owner occupiers of all the asset classes that we deal with: office, retail,
really?
and industrial. And because developers are building more of those small bay industrial, because the demand's gotten higher, the zonings are much more flexible. You're seeing more and more owner occupiers get into sort of that aspect.
And they're owning one individual unit.
One individual strata lot. And if you went back a couple years ago, if someone ever came to and said, hey, I have a retail unit, or I have an office space, or even a small bay industrial, I want to sell it, we'd always recommend to them that to get the best bang for their buck, it'd be better to tenant the property and then sell it to an investor. And we've almost seen a huge transition in that, especially in the past sort of 12, 16, 18 months, where products probably are worth almost as much, if not more, vacant, because the owner-occupier pool has grown that much, because there's so many more banking solutions now out there that will help you get into the land ownership game if you have a successful business. And banks like the BDC will go as far as actually doing 100% financing, including closing costs if you can afford it through the cash flow of the business, to get you into the ownership game. And they'll even look at sometimes 30, 35, 40-year amortization tables to make it affordable. So you can rent it for $2,500, but you're not having to pay $7,000 to own it. You can rent it for $25,000, or you may be able to own it if things all work out for maybe $3,500, which you're always better to sort of pay your own mortgage if you can versus somebody else's. So the owner-occupier pool is growing rapidly.
Yeah. I realized. Oh, I just realized you got your. I'm gonna fix your suit there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thanks, Sav. Didn't even notice.
Sav. Okay, now you're coming on the show.
Little fashion malfunction.
I'm supposed to try to be the type of person that'll actually let someone know. You can't see it on your camera angle, but
that's okay. As long as it's hidden, right?
What is for the banks? I guess I probably know the answer, but I would assume it's because they get to these people, the old money that's sitting there.
Yeah.
That property, the banks really don't make any money because that property is just sitting there unfinanced. So they've got motivation
for sure
to get people in. That's why the BDC and that is shifting over to.
And I think the thing too is, there's so much push more on entrepreneurs now to try to get in. And from a banking perspective, is instead of giving a small business owner a line of credit or operating line of credit or something like that, if you can help them get into the land business or the ownership of land or strata lots, whatever you want to call it, the bank's really putting themselves in a pretty strong position.
So now they have an asset.
Yeah, and they're hedging their bets, right? So in the event that anything ever didn't work out, the bank does have to step in. At least there's a large-scale asset the bank can sort of try to manage and try to take back to recoup their money. And year over year, you've seen increases on these real estate things. So the bank's really in a good, strong position to hedge their bet by helping these business owners get in there and actually get the land involved. And then from a business owner standpoint, down the road, if your property appreciates year over year and your business starts to get better, you got refinancing opportunities and stuff like that to get some money out of it to maybe help grow and expand your business further.
Right. Do you see, you must see with that entrepreneur side of it, you must see people trying to get in. How much of your work do you end up, they're trying to buy a company, and then as you start to dig in, half through the process, you realize they're not able to based on their cash flow. That do you run into that a lot?
It does happen. Banks aren't really as supportive about the business acquisition. If there's business with land involved, banks are a little more interested in it. you are seeing a lot of people who say own the business and the land now, where they'll sell the business and just become the landlord
Right.
out of it. So it's a little more challenging because there's a lot of aspects when you look at buying a business, from cash flow positions to one of the biggest things now that's a really big important about a lot of businesses now is the lease term. It's a huge asset in a sale because in a city like Vancouver and all the suburban markets around them, landlords have demo clauses in leases now where the building could be redeveloped.
Yeah.
So if I go pay $500,000, $1 million for an amazing coffee shop on a great corner, and there's a demo clause in the lease, I might not be there 3 years from now.
Right.
So there's a lot of stuff like that that takes place. That's sort of in emerging markets like we're in now in Vancouver for quite some time. I mean, the lease term and renewal terms become really important now in business sales.
Right. But for a company that is, let's say they're a few years old, they've got a little bit of cash flow.
Yeah.
What is, they're operating at 5%, which is a lot of businesses aren't.
Yeah.
How hard is it for them to actually get into, like let's say a $2 million company?
Yeah.
That's trying to get into a little unit like that, a
Yeah.
1,500 space with a
Yeah.
door.
Yeah.
How hard is it for them to actually get financed?
Well, I think the thing too, like BDC, which is the government subsidy program or
Right.
bank, they will look a lot more on the cash flow retained earnings of the company itself, more so than maybe the property, versus a traditional Charter One bank like a TD would look much more at the property than they would at the person buying it. And and BDC in that they'll also consider if you're paying $6,000 a month rent where you are right now, and they can get you into a landowner position and you're paying $6,500 and you're still profitable, they'll consider a lot of that stuff versus a lot of the Charter One banks or the credit unions will look at it more on a property acquisition, not
Yeah.
so much in a supportive position that say like a BDC's in. So that that's really driving a lot of it right now because lease prices have obviously gone up dramatically, especially like in industrial, and we're also seeing it now in offices, that for someone to lease a space versus own it, there isn't really much big of a delta anymore. So that's why BDC will look at these programs and stuff like that to really help try to promote small business owners to get in, because they're not really putting a whole bunch more strain on the business, but they're
Right.
also creating an asset for that business, which hopefully will help them grow at a later date.
Right. When you get into something like the that small unit on a big plot of land
Yeah.
that's had who knows what going on there
Yeah.
for 40 years.
Yeah.
What is that? And they want to rezone it. Someone wants to come in and buy it.
Yeah.
You got environmental assessments and all
Yeah.
this stuff. Can you unpackage what that process actually is?
For sure. So if you're buying land, especially like industrial sectors, development land, houses, it's pretty much almost guaranteed you're going to have to get an environmental test done on the site. And in the environmental test, there's various companies out there that do it. Banks want to see it because they don't really want to get in bed with contaminated land. And there's a phase one is the typical process you go through. So you could hire a company like Next Environmental, which we work with a lot with, which is great. They come in and they do sort of a historical overview of the site.
Yeah.
And they'll provide you a report. And if they're through the reporting process, they don't feel that the site is contaminated or has potential to be contaminated, they can issue a report saying the site's clean to the best of their knowledge. Banks will take that for financing purposes. If they go forward and there was oil tanks under the houses that haven't been removed, or there's been God knows what disposed on the property, they then goes to like a phase two process. And what they do there is they actually will physically drill the land, send the land away for testing. If it comes back that it's contaminated, a lot of banks get really weary of that because the cost to do these environmental things can be dramatically higher than everyone anticipates. And if I'm a developer and I'm paying today's land acquisition costs and the holding costs I have to sell 2 years down the road, if I anticipate contaminated soil might cost me $500,000-$600,000 to get rid of, and it's $2 or $3 million, my margins get really small. So typically, when you get into that stuff, a lot of banks, especially Charter One banks, they won't even look at it. You're gonna have to go to the private sector, and that's where you start getting into these like 10, 12, 15% interest rates with big fees up front. So I mean, it is a process. It's almost guaranteed you're gonna have to go through it from a land acquisition side of it with any bank now. But there's companies out there that do a good job, and they'll sort of walk you through the process. But it's typically like if you get a phase one done, you're looking at probably a week to 2 weeks to get the report back, which is part of your due diligence phase of your purchase. If it goes to a phase two process, your costs can go from 10, 15, 20,000 and up. And that process can take anywhere from 2 to 4 to 6 weeks. All depends on how bad the site could be. And there's times where they might drill a site and they think it's bad, and it becomes worse, and they got to come back and drill it again. So the cost can sometimes really get away from people. You see a lot of buyers once a phase one comes back that it needs further studies done. A lot of people shy off.
They just walk. Yeah.
Because a lot of them try to weigh out the thing. If I spend another 20 grand and I don't buy it, I'm out $25,000 cost of doing business at that point.
From the perspective of operating your business, how much of your time is tied up in, a small company that can't, and you end up, they can't afford to buy it,
Yeah.
or a big piece of land that's going to a purchaser wants to come in, an investor wants to come in, and then they realize the phase one doesn't come back good. How much of your time gets tied up with those projects that just simply don't work?
Yeah, we do our best when we're dealing with the clients at the very start to educate them on the process they're going to enter if they haven't done it before. And we have good relationships with a lot of environmental companies, banks, and stuff like that. So we'll kind of bounce them off a lot of that stuff, right, to make sure we're trying to vet them, not just for our sake, but also for their sake. It does happen. We've had deals on land acquisition where we thought it would be no problem whatsoever, and they find out in 1962 there was a dry cleaner across the street, and the environmental company won't sign off. So you mean we spend a month during due diligence, and we find a week before that further testing is needed. And sometimes you get sellers that they don't want to deal with that. They're like, no, I'm not going to extend your conditions period. Like, we're done. And you get buyers that don't want to spend the money on it. So you mean, I don't know what the percentage would be, but it does happen quite often. With regards to people trying to buy real estate, we really try to encourage them to go talk to their banks ahead of time, or we can put them in touch with bankers to make sure they're not wasting their time. You do get sort of the first time, maybe small business owner that wants to buy a piece of commercial real estate, either as an investor for their business, and they think they can put down 5%. I bought my house, I put down 5%. What do you mean I got to put down 25 or 35%? So you mean that the criteria is dramatically different when you get into the commercial acquisitions versus, say, a residential acquisition. So we try to educate them, push them in that direction. So we try to mitigate our time and also their time and the bank's time and everyone we're working with.
Yeah, is that 20%, 25% though? Is that percentage, because they could fund it at 0% if your cash flow is good, right? Is that right?
Yeah. So every bank will look at things on a case by case basis. So for example, if I'm going to buy a property from an investment standpoint, the banks will typically try to create a down payment structure that the property can service itself based on the rent the property could generate. If I'm buying it for an owner-occupier position, the banks will look much more into my business's cash flow, and that's where you can kind of get those 0% or zero down type opportunities if you're in a strong financial position from a business standpoint. If you get to the investment standpoint, 20, 25, 30, 35% sometimes can be a down payment that you'll have to come up with. Banks will look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Right. What about, I guess the last thing about this commercial, or the industrial side of it, what about agriculture land? What is that?
Challenging.
Challenging?
Yeah, you're really getting in bed with the government at that point when you're looking at that stuff. And there's people that will buy it, and they will sit back and hopefully down the road it comes out. But it's not usually the smartest thing we would suggest. The value of the property is usually dramatically less than a piece of property that would be in a similar state, similar location that's not tied up in the ARL. So we would never sort of recommend a lot of clients to buy that stuff if their thought pattern is, I'm going to do this with the land. If they're looking to create a land bank opportunity, or maybe their business can operate within it, totally different. But if you're looking at to buy it for an investment standpoint, it may not be the best because it's really challenging to deal with, and you're really dealing with both municipal and provincial level of government when you're having to do that stuff. And sometimes you almost need a lucky break sometimes, where maybe it wasn't part of the game plan, but now, based on population growth and density needed, that now may potentially be considered.
So if it's somehow within a city or something like that, it might be considered. But if it's out in Abbotsford, out in those fields,
it's something. It can be a wild card because, like I said, you're not really in control of your own destiny at that point. So we would never sort of stress to a client it's a good investment. More times than not, it's probably not going to work out in your best interest.
So I've never actually had a chance to ask anybody the question. So if you're rezoning for let's say an equipment yard, that is going to be a local permitting.
Yeah, so all the
agriculture would go up to provincial.
It can do, and it can even go to federal to some degree.
Really?
So anytime you're dealing with that, you're really dealing with governments and stuff like that. Versus if you deal with a rezoning application or something like that for development, or something under a local, something local that you're dealing with, it's going to go to the city of Vancouver, Burnaby for Burnaby.
Right.
The province puts the onus on all the cities, municipalities to handle their own zonings
Right.
and stuff like that process.
Oh, I see.
So that's why if you're ever going to look into getting into agricultural or something like that, you either want to get in there because your business can operate under those rules and regulations, or it's something that you mean it's just maybe you have too much money and it's your neighboring property, you just want to acquire it to sit on it and see what happens, right? So
yeah.
so anytime you're dealing with stuff like that, it's a little more challenging to work with.
Yeah, pretty interesting stuff actually. We have to take a quick break during
Sure.
the show to
More sponsors.
more sponsors. Remember when we had none? That was tough.
That was tough. We have a lot now, so that's good. But before I continue with our sponsors, I do want to talk about the Crownsman podcast. And our goal is to give a voice to industry. But if you are looking to kind of create your own show, we would be happy to help you. We have we make it quite affordable, and we have lots of options for you because, of course, we also just don't want to, help our industry, but also all industry.
Yeah.
So we are here to help you. You can contact us at by email at info@crownsman.com. You can visit our website, crownsman.com, or you can also contact us via social media at crownsmanp.
Cool.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
more sponsors.
More sponsors.
So we've got a structural geology and mining course for you.
Oh, yeah.
And this is put on by Sean Daly, who has a Bachelor of Science in Geology, a Master's of Engineering in Mining and Engineering. And the purpose of this course is to learn practical aspects of the relationship between structural geology and mining with an emphasis on open pit. And the course starts May 6th, so please go and register. You can register by emailing peter.daly@hotmail.com, or you can follow the link in the video description below. So please go and register. Also, we're brought to you by Savanaugh Equipment, and they supply new and used mining equipment. If you need everything from slurry pumps to jaw crushers to ball mills to conveyors, you can go to the leader in used mining equipment, Savanaugh Equipment. And you can visit them at savanaughEquipment.com, where you will find more equipment every day, and of course, electrical too.
Yes. Did Marty get into any of the shots? I was looking at the monitors.
Oh, I don't think. No, but
well-
you know what? I will bring him in anyways. This is Savanaugh Equipment.
We helped design that.
We did.
Back in the
so
day.
visit savanaughEquipment.com.
By Marty's.
Yes. Yes,
don't-
actually, you can buy Marty's.
Oh,
if,
yeah,
if
they do
you know
sell
you have
them.
children and
They
you want to
also-
give them something.
They also give them away. So
They do.
um,
Now
Who else we got?
we also have Power Zone equipment. When you need a specialized pump for any type of fluid handling or dewatering, then you'll want to have your pump designed by Power Zone Equipment. You can visit them at powerzoneequipment.com, where you'll find thousands of new and rebuilt pumps, motors, and engines.
thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We've had them on the show too.
We do.
Okay. Okay. Actually, I think you had some questions.
It's my turn.
Go ahead, yeah. Feels like an answer.
This is good cop,
And,
bad cop.
And I can get pretty nosy. So I want to
should be
know
worried
more.
at this point.
Yeah.
I want to know more about you, kind of where
Sure.
you started, your background, and why real estate.
Always had a passion for real estate, especially commercial real estate. We started William Wright Commercial about 6 years ago now. Before that, I worked at a residential brokerage, but did commercial out of there. And really because, I mean, in commercial, there's sort of been a stigma attached to, I think, a long time. And the typical commercial model for years has been sort of a large-scale brokerage in a downtown market like Vancouver, where you might have 100 commercial brokers working out of there. And I was always, we look at trends and we look at housing prices and all this stuff, and we really firmly believe that the marketplace is going to continue to go to the valley markets and so on. So I think it challenged a lot of owners outside of maybe the Vancouver marketplace. Really felt that maybe someone in downtown Vancouver calling them to tell them how their piece of land in Langley should work, there was probably a disconnect. And I think at the same point in time, a lot of people that buy into commercial real estate, they buy into it purely as an investment. And they may not necessarily know how it works, right? So we really focused on kind of that sort of that smaller marketplace, because a lot of them sort of felt maybe they're kind of intimidated or a number in the system type of thing at a much larger international brokerage. So we wanted to kind of create these boutique style offices, where right now we have offices in Vancouver, New Westminster, and the Fraser Valley and Langley, boutique style offices where we have sort of local professionals that are on the ground in the area. They're partaking in the local chamber of commerce and stuff like that. And then we're sort of giving local advice because maybe what happens in Vancouver might not apply to Abbotsford. So that we really felt there was sort of a niche marketplace there that we could kind of go that route because people that bought land for $500,000 10 years ago, they might now be sitting on some prime piece of property worth millions, and they just don't know what to do with it. So we really focused on that: customer service, communication, consistency, and really trying to make both our staff but also our clients feel like they're not a number in our system. We do a Christmas party for all of our clients every year. We do a summer party every year for them. We have our William Wright Helping Hands Foundation we launched where we raise toys for various causes and stuff like that through the holiday seasons. So we really wanted to make people feel like they're a part of something, not just a number in our system, whether it's a client or a staff member. And we sort of created these boutique offices, had overwhelming success with that model, so much so that we were expanding. We just expanded the New West office. We just doubled the size of the Vancouver office. We put our Langley office out there last year, and it was really transcending with a lot of landowners out there and even tenants too, because if someone calls and they're looking for something, we have local knowledge, we can supply them. We know the streets they're talking about. And also from a landowner perspective, one of the challenges I think a lot of landowners felt with is maybe a Vancouver broker gets a phone call Thursday at 3 o'clock for a showing at 6 because the guy's outside his building in Chilliwack. Well, let's call a spade a spade. He's not driving out to Chilliwack at that time. So with us having local offices, we can show buildings right away. And we're getting really, really good responses in that way. And then the landowners kind of like it because you're kind of speaking their local language to them. So we've had a huge success with it. Right now we're sort of branching out. We have our irons in the fire both in Victoria and Kelowna, which we want to take the concept there too and just sort of repeat what we're doing. I think there's also a trend in that because land prices have gone up so much over the years that so many people that maybe bought a small bay industrial or a warehouse along commercial just for their own business now have multi-million-dollar property. And they almost get kind of intimidated by the bigger suit and tie brokerage maybe that might be sitting downtown with hundreds and hundreds of brokers. So those people now, so we really focus on trying to pay attention to those people and also educate them in the process. Really take care of them, make sure start to finish they're there. And then I think at the end of the day, we're really passionate about what we do. We love what we do. For us, it's not a job. We get up every morning. I know. I'm on the phone 7 days a week. I know, just because that's the business we're in. But we're going to continue to sort of grow and expand this concept outside of the Lower Mainland and stuff like that.
Awesome. What is something that you kind of take on a daily basis, in the business that you kind of live by that, and that's something that defines your business as well?
Well, I think one thing too is we really try to execute on what we tell people, and in our business. The entry level to our business up until a couple of years ago was quite easy for people to get in. It was, of course, the UBC. You kind of got a license and you kind of did whatever you want. And I think the industry sort of suffered a little bit from that, where we really try to focus on quality over quantity. And we've been like that from the properties we deal with, the landlords and clients we deal with, and also from a staff perspective. There's some brokerages, maybe their concept is maybe the opposite of that. They try to get as much as they can, and if 30% sell or 50% sell, well, 50% of 100 is greater than 50% of 10. We were kind of the reverse on that. We really, really focus on making sure we start a project and we see it through and we execute on it. Because in our business, it's a business of execution. And I think enough now that everyone knows a real estate broker, whether it's residential or commercial. Everyone knows somebody in Vancouver. And we really try to focus on start to finish with the clients and making sure that we really, really execute on it because it becomes a business of execution. And I think the days of someone picking up their phone and calling Remax and say, hey, I live in New Westminster, I have a house I want to sell, and an agent shows up, it's kind of like I talked to my neighbor whose daughter's a realtor. And it's not so much the brand name associated with it anymore.
Yeah.
And that's why we really focus on making sure we get sold and lease stickers up on everything we do, because it shows that we're carrying on with following through with what we do.
Yeah.
We started on. Yeah. And that's sort of really helping build it. And what's happened is from the focus point we started with 6 years ago, because we've been sort of really executing on what we started, now the client list gets larger and larger and larger, and the client names get bigger and bigger and bigger because they're seeing the results. We've had times where we've taken over listings from other brokerages that they might have had it for a long period of time. It hasn't worked out, and then we will fill it in 30, 40, 60 days for them. And the client almost sits back very, very impressed. And I just want to, we want to tell them that, hey, we answer our phones, we show the property whenever we're called upon, we follow up with them. Just simple, we think it's general business concepts and making sure, because I know as on a landowner side myself, is I would be very frustrated if my broker wasn't picking up his phone or wasn't showing the property at a certain time, because I have probably a pretty hefty mortgage I got to pay. Right? So we really try to really hammer that home with the staff that we have, and we really focus on quality and quantity on who we hire. And I've never been a believer in hiring someone based off their history in our industry, because I've always hired people based on personality and characteristics. Because when you're up there doing a pitch, you might have 10, 15 people you're pitching to, a Strata Wind Up or a board for all we know, and your Harvard degree isn't stapled to your forehead. They're buying into the individual at the time.
Yeah.
And if you have the charisma and you got the confidence and the personality to carry a conversation and engage with people, I'll hire that person all day long versus a guy maybe I worked at a bigger brokerage for 20 years, because I don't want to say you can't teach old dogs new tricks, but we really want to get those energetic individuals part of the company on board, and we're confident we can train.
Yeah.
I mean, if you bring the personality to the table, we can train you how our business works and how we operate as a company. And with the exception of one individual, everyone we've hired so far came to the table with no commercial real estate experience. And we have a lot of success stories, one sitting over there, that they've worked really, really hard, and they've built a great, phenomenal business for themselves, and they continue to build a business for themselves. Just because, like I said, we hire much more on the individual, more so on the resume attached to the commercial real estate industry.
Wow. Have you found, or I'm sure you have, but any major challenges?
Yeah, I think when we were starting out, obviously we were very boutique, and we still are boutique style. We don't try to get away from that. But when you compete sometimes with the larger brokerages of the world, international brokerages of the world, that's kind of their pitch. And we were boutique, and you're fighting for territory and stuff like that. So that's why we would really try to focus on listing and then selling and leasing products, so we can really focus on showing that. So over time, that's helped us dramatically. And I think a lot of people, they take notice of that. They don't really buy in so much for the brand as once it was maybe years ago. They just want to see the names and they want to get the signs up. So that was always a challenge when we were starting there, to try to build the business and battle that aspect of it. I think you are seeing a bit of a trend right now, where there's smaller boutique style brokerages opening, and clients aren't as scared to take on those boutique brokerages where maybe once before. An international brokerage might tell you they have 10,000 agents worldwide. Well, I don't think somebody in their New Mexico office is buying the land in Vancouver. I'm sorry, I don't think it's going to happen. So, that was a challenge we've had, and then other challenges we have, because we've had a lot of success at an early stage. The growth factor, right? Having good people, and I've always been a big believer that if we don't find the right person, we won't take it on. And we've actually turned down work over the years, to the surprise of some clients, because if we can't service the property or service the client 110%, I would rather say, we really appreciate the opportunity, but we just don't have the bodies right now.
Yeah.
And from a client standpoint, they kind of look shocked, like, you don't want my business. And that's not the case. I just don't want to upset you. And I know right now, from the capacity that we're running, if we can't service it 110%, we're going to let you down. And in our business, you let down one person, he tells 10, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of clients, they kind of have a level of respect for that. If we can't take the project on right now, we'll actually come back around a year after and say, hey, I have another project. Can you take me on now? Versus us taking them on and just disappointing them.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
What is when you said about the personality of people? Excuse me. How much of that, when that transaction is being done, how much of is it the buyer? You've got the place listed.
Yeah.
They know the numbers. They're going to get a deal done.
Yeah.
You, as the real estate agent, are going to facilitate that for them.
Correct.
How easy is it to lose that client? And I'm asking because I genuinely don't know this answer, because in some cases, if I'm buying something, I'm buying it.
Yeah.
But in other cases, like I just went out and got a new car, and I took, actually, Gowdy, you sent me to now I just forgot their name. What's wrong?
New
with
Westminster Toyota.
New Westminster, yeah. Shout out to them. They were
Yeah.
they were really amazing. So like it almost took me back how helpful they were. And so I bought the exact same car I was going to buy, but they were the third place I went to.
Yeah.
And it was price somewhat.
Yeah.
But it was also, so how easy is it, I guess, to
Extremely
lose
easy to lose a client.
Is
like,
it?
You can lose them in a snap of a
like
finger.
like someone who actually wants to buy a property?
Correct. And what happens is because there's just so many realtors out there, and in commercial, there's probably, I don't know the exact number, I'm just guessing 500, say, maybe dedicated commercial brokers that sort of work the marketplace in the Lower Mainland, versus you might have like 25 or 30,000 residential brokers. out there.
It's crazy.
And it's a very competitive landscape. And I
Yeah.
think in our business, and this is one thing we really try to stress both to everyone that works with us, is I think in our business, there's a really low level of respect for people's inventory. And we're in a business where people literally give us free inventory. Here's my $10 million building. This is from my dad. I got it left in a will. It's the biggest asset I'll ever own. And I don't think a lot of people have a respect level for that. And there are a lot of entrusting in us. So we will always try to go as far as we can, probably far over and above what's required of us to make sure they're taken care of. And that's why we have our client parties at Christmas time and our client parties in the summertime, just so they know that we really generally do care.
Yeah.
And we focus really hard on aftermarket service. And a big problem, I think, with our industry is a lot of guys get paid through once the sale closes and they never show up again. We are the 180 degrees from that. We will continue to go back to them, check in, make sure things are okay. How can we help you? And we really stress to a lot of people is you never know where a transaction goes. Some of our biggest clients, and we're talking tens and tens of millions of dollars in buildings, we met through the tiniest 300 square foot retail space. And because we really try to stress that we deal every transaction the same, whether it's a $3 million sale or a 3,000 square foot lease, we try to treat the transaction process the exact same. And they spawn really quickly into much bigger clients. We've spent almost zero money to date marketing ourselves as a company. We focus really hard on social media and making sure people know what we're doing, sales and listings we have, but we never sort of really taken a lot of ad space
Right.
to really promote the business. It's all been referral.
Yeah.
And one thing you find in commercial is this guy owns this building, he owns the building next to him, and his neighbor owns the building next to him. So you can build a really good business opportunity by taking care of people. So to answer your question, we focus extremely hard on that client, start to finish, and then thereafter, because it's too easy to learn it. And in our business too, I mean, we're an easy scapegoat. If a transaction goes sour, it's the realtor's fault.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that can be very, very true. We try to focus on really educating the client in the process, holding their hand start to finish, and then we focus heavily on aftermarket service to make sure that they're fully taken care of for not just months but years to come, because there's probably another opportunity they're going to have down the road, and we want to make sure that we're there to help service them. But I mean, it can go sour really quick, especially when people are spending millions and millions of dollars, or potentially they're trying to release a new space for their business. I mean, you're really talking about people's livelihoods that you're working with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can lose it really, really quickly. And I think people, I mean, kind of like your situation in the car purchase, I would be more than happy to pay more for good service. Where I know
Exactly.
I wouldn't discount or cheap out on buying something to get cheaper service, because I really believe you're going to get what you pay for.
Yeah.
So I'm more than happy to pay more for something to know that I'm taken care of, and I also feel comfortable, peace of mind at the end of the day, that I know that it's been dealt properly and I can sleep at night, not worrying about something else. And we try to take that same thing and try to apply it to our industry, which probably maybe hasn't had the best name for the longest time, and that's why we sort of really focus on our communication, consistency, and customer service are kind of the three core values we sort of built the business on, and we believe in those. We really do, and we really try to make sure that we take care of people, and year after year our client party gets bigger and bigger, and the venue has to change again and again and again. And I think it's a good example of it's working, and people appreciate that, right?
Yeah. I wanted to go a little bit into the not the individual residential, but the multi-person residential. And you also mentioned about the presentations to, called it like a Strata Upgrade?
A Strata Wind Up.
A Strata Wind Up. Can you actually just walk us through those couple things?
Yeah. So about a year, maybe 2 years ago, there was some new laws brought into the Strata game. And because cities are struggling to create density opportunities, you might have a low-rise building, maybe 2-story, 3-story, 4-story, wood frame building that now sits on a major corridor, maybe right down the street from a SkyTrain station, for example. And before, because you might have 40 units in the building, 50 units in the building, they're all stratified, so they're all individual ownership. And because there might be a greater opportunity to put a tower on that site now, we've brought new laws and legislation into place that allows for what we call Strata Wind Up. So how that works is the Strata Corporation, which is the union sort of all the owners together, 40 for example, they can now sell the parcel versus having to sell every individual condo to make it happen. And how it works is, in a Strata Wind Up process, is if 50% or greater of the Strata Corporation, the owners, approve to let the property be put for sale, then it can be put for sale.
Only 50%?
Only 50% to put for sale. What happens is, when an offer comes in to be accepted or whatever, you need 80% at this point.
Oh.
So if you have 80% at this point, what happens is, at that point, once the offer is accepted, it has to go forward for court approval, and everybody gets their day in court. So let's, for argument's sake, say there's 96% in favor and there's 4 or 5 people that aren't. the judge will hear those 4 or 5 people's stories. And then
Wow.
the judge can then rule on it if the property to be sold or not be sold. And a good example is if you just go down the street down here, the big townhouse complex that's up for a Strata Wind Up, that's what happens. Is now there's these new programs in place, legislation in place, that allows for it. And I don't know what the exact percentages of what gets passed and not passed, but I've heard stories of, people that have to get relocated because they're being forced to sell, and other stories where there's been sympathy probably put towards the ownership group, and it hasn't passed. So I've heard it's gone both ways. If you look like in the Coquitlam area, next in the Austin area next to the golf course up there, Anthem Properties had some successful Strata wind-ups. There's lots of Strata wind-ups going on up by the Burquitlam SkyTrain station. So cities look at it, and the province has kind of brought in the legislation that now allows for it, because you can take all these old wood frame buildings that maybe nobody wanted that people live in, but now you may be able to triple or sometimes even quadruple the amount of people you can put in the same properties. That's where the Strata wind-ups have come in now.
So the Strata wind-up process is 50%, 80%. That's legislated.
Yeah.
But the actual sale of the property is not legislated. That gets decided in court.
That's court approved. Yeah. So you need at least 50% of the Strata Corporation to vote in favor of actually listing the property.
Yeah.
Once an offer is brought forward, you need about 80%, at least 80% to vote to accept the offer.
Okay.
And then from there it goes to court approval. And you might have 20% opposing it. You might have 1% opposing it. But then it goes to court approval, and then everyone kind of gets their day in the court to sort of plead their case either way, and then the court will decide if the property is to be sold or not.
What would be an example of somebody saying? What would be an example of a case where like one person says, "Oh, these are the reasons"? I mean, what would be an example of?
I think you might have somebody maybe who's lived in this property for say 20, 30 years. Right, and maybe they're an elderly person, maybe they're on fixed income retirement, something like that.
Right.
That if they sell their property here in New Westminster, they might be living in Alberta because they just don't have the financial means to live here. So that's kind of why, they get their day in the court. They can kind of say their story, and there's been some hardship stuff you've read where the court has sort of said, "Yep,"
because it really depends on the judge sitting there.
It does, right? And they're going to probably, and also I think there's probably some factor. Is it 20% opposed or is it 1% opposed?
Yeah.
And they kind of go through that opportunity.
Yeah.
I think they also look at things. They probably also consider the cost of living. Like, okay, is your condo worth $300,000 if you sell it as an individual condo, and you're getting $700,000 for it through a development opportunity?
Yeah. Well, I guess if you just bought in last year and now all of a sudden it's only $750, you're going, I just got here.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's stories like that where people have just moved in, and then you also see things too where investors now will look at those opportunities too, right? Where they'll look at major SkyTrain hubs, and they'll look at some of these low-level strata buildings, 4 stories and stuff like that, or townhouse complexes that sort of fall within the OCP for greater density. There's an investment strategy behind it. If I can acquire land in there at today's condo prices, buying it as a condo, and I kind of look at maybe an exit down the road through a Strata wind-up, there's opportunity and lifts that probably sit there.
Yeah.
There's also been stories where we've heard developers will sort of start to cherry pick in a Strata, and then in turn now they have votes. So when it comes to that 80%, there's votes. And there was a story, and I can't remember which complex it was. It was in Vancouver a couple of years ago, and I read a story that a developer had sort of been cherry picking a lot of the units over the years. Came to the Strata wind-up. It was the court did not approve it because they deemed that the developer had too many condos there and was sort of making I don't say unfaithful, but kind of not the best decision with regards to what's happening. And the judge kind of said no.
So they had actually bought the
They
units.
actually bought there. So they're buying votes, really, right?
Yeah.
So when it comes to get that 80%, if I'm 27% of the 80 needed, that's going to help
There
me a
you
lot
go.
more if I'm one, right? So and the judge actually they just said no go, thanks but no thanks.
How often does it get court approval? Does the sale go through?
I don't know the exact percentages. I've sort of heard mixed. I've been told 50-50, 75-25.
Okay.
I think those numbers will obviously sway year over year now that more and more are coming to the forefront. And a good example is if you look up at the Burquitlam SkyTrain station, you got all those little low-rise buildings that are all Strata wind-up opportunities and being sold and becoming much bigger. So I think it's a case-by-case basis, and I think what you're going to see is the more that it's new to the courts right now, and they're creating precedences as they go. But the more and more density needed, the more and more I think that will kind of play out, and the more results will probably favor the Strata wind-up versus the small homeowner that can't.
Yeah.
So you've been in those meetings?
We've pitched to them before. We've pitched to stratas to get it. So we typically would pitch to the council
Yeah.
Okay.
and go to the council first.
Which are also owners a lot of times, right? Or is
We
that a
are not
ma-
owners. No,
No, I mean
No.
like the council you're talking to. Is that a is that a hired management group or is that owners?
it's a
on the
combination.
coun-
So what
yeah.
happens is, so you have a strata corporation, which is every owner who buys gets a strata vote, I guess, for lack
Yeah.
of better words, and then they will appoint a strata council made up of owners.
A made up of
Yeah,
owners,
and the strata council will work with the hired strata management company.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times when we're pitching to these stratas, we're pitching to the council, we're pitching to the strata management company. Usually attends the meetings, and there might be a handful of strata lot owners there as well.
That must get interesting.
Usually the people that are there are very for it.
Oh, I
right?
see.
So they're there to show support.
Yeah.
They're asking questions, right? They got the dollar signs in the eyes.
Yeah.
And then usually what it is when it actually goes forward where it's listed and stuff like that, that's where you sometimes get maybe the people that aren't so fond of it that sort of share their opinions with you in the elevator. But it's a reality in a developing marketplace
Yeah.
like we're in.
Yeah.
And I think the numbers are, I don't know the exact number, but you got 60, 70,000 people a year moving to Metro Vancouver. We might be getting up, I don't know, maybe 10,000 doors delivered if we're lucky. So we kind of go through ripples and ups and downs, but I think the long-term supply and demand is there. It's not gonna be able to outweigh what they're trying to stop right now, or they're trying to slow the market down. There's just too many people coming in.
Yeah. Off air, you were talking a little bit about minimizing the amount that landlords can increase rent,
Yeah.
and that is actually going to have a reverse effect.
Totally.
And is that something you've seen? Can you explain that a bit as well?
So what it is like, right now, the NDP has put a cap on what residential rents can sort of increase year over year. And it's about 2.5% of what the previous year is. And what we've seen happen is where governments have stepped in and tried to cap rental rates through private sector money, it has a really, really bad outcome. And what you're seeing right now is if I'm a multifamily owner and I have a building that has 15, 20 units in it or whatever, if my income or my potential income is capped at 2.5%, yet my property taxes are going up, my cost of recycling and garbage is going up, my cost of hydro is going up, not right now, but sooner than later, my interest rates are going to go up if I'm carrying a mortgage. Why am I going to invest into a property where I have a restricted income increase of 2.5%, but my bottom line might be going up by 5 or 6%? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I understand why they bring it in. Like, I understand what the purpose of it is. But what happens is people are investing tens of millions of dollars to buy these buildings and develop these properties. And if I'm going to invest that type of money, but you're going to restrict how that money flows, I'm not going to invest it. I'll go build overpriced condos. And what you're seeing is a lot of these people will eventually start to pivot on where they put the money in. So I think long term, it's a short-term solution, but it's a long-term problem, because what's going to happen is eventually the supply of rental properties will start to diminish because people won't be interested in buying multifamily buildings and fixing them up. They won't be interested in buying purpose-built rentals and developing them because now I'm being told how I can spend my money. And when I'm investing 10, 15, 20 million dollars for you to tell me what I can do and can't do, not a lot of guys with that type of money are going to listen.
Yeah.
So what they do is they just go build something else.
Yeah.
Right? So I think you're going to see in the short term, there's probably a lot of hands in the air high-fiving, but what's going to happen in the coming years is as that starts to filter through, supply and demand is going to kick in a lot worse than it is now, because the supply pool is going to fall and demand is going to increase, which what happens is once my tenant moves out, it's fair market for whatever I charge. So if my tenant was paying me $1,500 and there's a lineup of people that are willing to pay me $2,000, well, guess what? I'm charging $2,000 and I'm going to get it. And then when the next person leaves in the building, my greatest comparable is my $2,000. Well, the vacancy rate's gone down. Now it's $2,200. So what's going to happen over time is the supply pool shrinks, demand increases, and rents will actually go up further.
Yeah,
And
because
that's a
eventually
problem.
people will move, things will reset, and it'll.
Yeah, it'll create. It's a problematic problem waiting to happen. And when you look at, from a Vancouver geographical region, is people, Amazons and Apples and all that, they're planting. They're taking up hundreds of thousands of square feet downtown Vancouver, and they're going to bring in all of these young professionals,
5,000-6,000 jobs at a
that
time.
are going to have the money to pay $2,500 a month because they're working in the tech industry, They've got a lot of disposable income, and they're going to be able to pay this type of money based on their salaries and their income, and that's going to push it out even further for people that maybe don't have those same opportunities. And
Yeah.
when you take supply and you're bringing potential more money into the area through job creation, and you're shrinking the supply pool, and Vancouver, we're landlocked with what we can do, you're going to drive rates up even higher. And I think if you look at Seattle, this past year, I think they lifted the rental restrictions 3 or 4 years ago. And this past year, they actually had a decline in rental rates in the downtown core. And what it is when you take off with those restrictions, you encourage private sector money to invest. Versus you put restrictions on it, private sector money goes elsewhere. And they're going to go build small bay industrials, or they're going to go build overpriced condos. And that's the problem I think that we're going to run into in the next 2 to 3 years, because we can't deliver as many doors needed for people coming in right now. And I think, it's just going to be a problematic situation.
So new developments they'll simply just start higher. They'll anticipate that this is going to be here.
If I was going to build, if I had money and I could build a rental building, and there's some programs like with the city of Vancouver that they're kind of debating on right now, incentives to build rental programs for private sector. And if I have a piece of land and I'm looking to build residential on it and I want to rent it out in a rental building, but you now as a government are going to tell me what I can do and can't do with how I can control my income. Well, guess what? I'm just going to build overpriced condos.
Right.
And I'm going to sell them at overpriced. And then as an individual buyer, I'm going to buy a strata lot for $600,000-$700,000. And they're going to be, well, to service my debt, I got to charge $2,500. And again, it creates that thing. Or people, they just cancel the applications altogether. Or maybe they say, you know what? I don't want to build a strata building. Maybe I'll look at doing a mixed-use development, or maybe I'll look at office, or maybe I'll just sell the land off. And it creates a lot of uncertainty out there.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of coupled with some local municipalities right now that have made some questionable decisions. There's a lot of uncertainty in the development business right now, which doesn't create a lot of good outcomes for renters in the coming years if supply is not available to them.
Yeah. So they're protected in the next 2 years.
Yeah.
But over time, then
it's going to be a problem because there won't be any new inventory coming in.
So essentially, you're saying rather than protect the renters, now you should be you need to bring in those the foreign buyer the foreign buyer tax. Does it apply to
it doesn't apply to commercial acquisitions. So
now commercial being do multi-unit dwellings fall under commercial?
So anything that has a residential zoning attached to it would qualify for the foreign buyer's tax. So multifamily would apply for it, for the foreign buyer's tax. So does it help? Probably not a lot, because a lot of the people that are buying the foreign buyer money, I guess, that's out there, they're not really buying the multifamily buildings so much. They're more into the new construction condos or the development land itself type of thing. There's not a lot of it in there, so it doesn't really weigh a whole lot on it. What the government has to figure out is they got to create incentives for private sector money to build rental properties to create housing. And I think the reality is 20 years ago, you're kind of 19, 20, you're like, I'm going to go buy a house. And the reality is now is you're 19, 20, you're going to rent. And then you're going to rent again, and you might even rent again. And then you buy your first condo. And then you live there for a couple of years, then you save up and you buy your townhouse. And you kind of almost make stepping stones to get to a house now. And I think that's just the reality we're going to live in, because the market's so far gone for a lot of people. The guy in a $20 million house in Shaughnessy, whether it's for 20 or 18, he's still sleeping. It's not the market is so far gone for a lot of that stuff. So they got to sort of, I think, almost pivot the thought pattern and try to really, really engage with private sector money, because the government says that they're going to go build it all themselves, and that's just the reality. Is it's not going to happen. The land acquisition costs are the highest and most challenging thing to deal with right now.
And then they'll realize that they have to raise it more than 2.5%.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe if they get in, maybe they just take the cap right off.
Yeah. Sorry, I wanted to get a clarification on something though. The multi-person, if there's 23 units or more, it goes into commercial if it's a one-time buyer. I didn't quite understand that.
So multifamily would be considered sort of like a building itself that maybe is not stratified, or it could be stratified, that one owner buys it. So say me and you are going to partner, we're going to buy a building and there's 15 units in there, that would be considered a multifamily purchase.
Okay.
Typically, we don't deal with anything like in the duplex or the fourplex world. So when you get over that level, you sort of get into like the quotations, the commercial aspect of it.
Right.
And that's kind of the tipping point for us on the commercial aspect of it, sort of what we do and don't do. Versus someone, there might be 30 or 40 condos in a building, they're stratified, so everyone can buy individual condos. Yeah. So we will typically deal with the multifamily sector of it. The buying an individual condo for investment purposes would fall more into the residential world.
Right. So someone buying a 30 unit residential area, that sort of goes into commercial.
Correct.
Now that considered commercial by like the foreign buyer tax, does it apply to like a commercial investment like
Yeah,
that?
so anything that has a residential zoning attached to it could qualify
Oh,
for it.
okay.
And that's how they kind of do it. So if you're buying land and the land is zoned residential at the time of acquisition, it would qualify.
Right.
Right? So I think you're finding I think with what the government's trying to do right now is problematic, I think, for the long term, just for all of us in the real estate world, whether we're landowners or brokers or developers, is you can't come in and try to really bully the system and beat it up or try to stop it. And that's kind of what all of their various things are trying to do. And I think you have your stress test that came in on the residential side, which is there to protect all of us so we don't have an American economy issue like they had where people were buying houses they couldn't afford.
Right.
And as rates went up, people were just getting locked out of their houses, literally. So I think the market would sort of plateau and almost kind of self-engage itself to slow itself down.
Yeah.
But what you do is when you bring in and you sort of create all these new rules and regulations and additional taxes and City of Vancouver's home vacancy tax and the speculation tax and all this stuff, you could just create a whole bunch of uncertainty out there.
Yeah.
And by doing that, banks start to question stuff, landowners and homeowners start to question stuff, and it really sort of just slows down the marketplace. And I'm not a mathematician by any stretch of the imagination, but if my number one driver for my surplus every year comes from property transfer tax, and I go kill that marketplace, yet I'm spending the government coffers to build bridges, but I won't charge for those. I think it's just a problematic
Yeah.
loss leader coming down the pipe that
Yeah.
all of us are going to have to pay for at some point.
And so do you think, and I think you kind of answered this question, but do you think there should be any protection for somebody who is on, they're on an annual renewal on their lease, and now the landlord comes in and says, well, I want to raise it 10%. And I mean, they know the person can't afford it. They got to move. But what you're saying is if you give that incentive for developers, that person goes, fine.
Yeah.
And they move.
Yeah.
Essentially, that's
what
what
you
you're
have to
saying.
do. You have to create supply, and that's the problem we don't have right now.
And then you won't have the landlord coming in at the 10%.
Because if you go and you lift the caps off and you let landlords just have a free wild west of what things would charge, is there short-term problematics? Probably, because there's nowhere for people to go.
Yeah.
Right? So there would be short-term impact on that side. But in the coming years, it will plateau itself and maybe even start to digress a little bit, because what you're going to do is you're going to get people that will go invest money into private sector to build more, which once it creates supply. And if you're my landlord and you come to me and say, hey, you're paying $1,000 now, you're paying $1,500, and there's 3 buildings next door to me, all that have spaces for me to move, I'm just going to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And there's a good chance the next guy's not paying $1,500 because he's following me to the building next door.
Yeah.
So you got to deal with a supply and demand issue.
Yeah.
And I think right now, obviously, we're going through a little bit of a rocky stage in the residential market and a little bit of decline. But if supply comes in, it will help balance everything.
Yeah.
And we're very fortunate, such a beautiful city and province we live in. You can see why people from all over the world come here and they want to stay here, right? So that part you have to be aware of. It's just like an LA or a San Francisco and all this stuff that they're dealing with. But if you come in and really just try to like bully it and charge people all this stuff, it's just going to have negative impact down the road. And everyone's forgetting about the supply issue. Everyone's trying to stop what's there now, but unless we keep replenishing that supply in the coming years, too many people are coming here and there's not going to be enough supply. It's just going to have a bad impact.
Well, sorry, it's I think it's the fastest or one of the fastest growing cities in Canada.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I've read stuff that they figure that Surrey will surpass Vancouver and become the largest city relatively quickly.
Look at what they're doing in Burnaby. And
It's
now,
nuts.
like, you're even looking into, you mentioned you're going to go out you're looking at Kelowna now.
Yeah.
Even Kamloops now is starting to, which is kind of Kamloops is like the last little big city in BC, right?
Yeah. And you look at, and people have done really well as a homeowner in the Lower Mainland, and that obviously sparks some money where now you got a little bit of equity in your house, or maybe you sell it, and places to look like is California, or it's like California, Kelowna, the California of Canada, they call it, right?
Yeah.
Beautiful city, right? So people may buy a secondary house up there, or you even look at people going over to the Vancouver Island area, which is great value, and that's why we want to get one of our offices over there. Is great value to buy still. Yes, it is expensive, but may not be as expensive. There's great investment opportunities over there. And they suffer with the same thing we do here. They suffer with inventory, right?
Yeah.
From a residential standpoint. So, there's good development opportunities, and you're seeing a lot more development really come. I was in Victoria last year, and I was just blown away how much it has matured. And when you're coming into the city, you're thinking you're driving through these little suburban markets, and all of a sudden, boom, these 10 buildings show up on the waterfront. No, it's sprawling.
Yeah.
Out, and you look at various markets around it that are highly successful now because of it, right? So, You mean that's where I think it's problematic. But then you go back to sort of the speculation tax, they call it. You apply that to Kelowna, you could potentially really destroy that marketplace up there from a residential standpoint, because if my second house now costs me $20,000-$30,000 a year more to keep it, I don't want it.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
enough people are in the same boat and everyone goes to the market at the same time, guess what? Now you have inventory, which is great, but if no one's buying the inventory, then then you start to see things go in the reverse than what we've seen over there for a while.
Well, and I like the stat I said at the very beginning of the show, 76% of Canadians have their money, their wealth tied up in real estate. You have to be really, really careful before you start messing around with that.
Well, yeah, no, for sure.
And rather than encouraging more investment into it, you start trying to essentially cap the growth of it.
Yeah.
It actually amazes me that anybody would even touch that. The problem is, though, I guess now once you like right now, if they took the cap off, the buildings aren't there right now.
Yeah.
So
it's going to have a short-term impact for sure.
So, but you think you could do something would go, okay, in 3 years, we take these caps off.
Yeah, or they could even have a progressive thing and say,
So
hey, the maximum increase is 4% this year, 5% next year, 6% the year out. So you can kind of
So then the
progressively-
developers come in, start
so it
developing.
encourages the marketplace,
Yeah.
right? Because if I'm going to take $10 million of private sector money, and I'm limited to what I can drive my revenue up every year, but there's no limit on property tax increases. There's no limit on hydro or gas. You mean Canadian, Western, the garbage company. There's no limit on what they can drive up their numbers every year. So my income is capped, but my expenses aren't.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I never thought, and I guess I never really realized it until you said it with real estate, is in any other business, you have tools to grow.
Yeah.
With residential, with property, the business is the person that's in there.
For sure.
And so it's a different type
Every
of model.
business, doesn't matter what industry you're in, is bloodlines is revenue.
Yeah.
And if I'm a landlord, my revenue is rent,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
From a residential standpoint. So if my revenue is capped or controlled, why would I want to invest in it?
Yeah.
I'd want to go somewhere else, right? And I think what you're seeing and some other things that I think are going to create some challenges out there is you look at Port Coquitlam has now adopted what they're saying is the stiffest renovation laws, and New West is on board with them as well, is if I go buy a building, and I fully 100% understand the tenant standpoint. I don't want to sound like I'm not naive to their situation.
Mm-hmm.
But if I buy a building that's 20 or 30 years old that is in dire need of fixing up, and I'm paying $6, $7, $8 million for the building, I go in there and I have to unfortunately reposition the tenants in order to renovate it, and then I go rent it at fair market value. I'm not getting an extraordinary return on my numbers. I might be getting a 4 or 5% capitalization rate on my total cost to acquire and then my CapEx to build it. I'm not getting some extraordinary 20% return on my money.
No.
And with what Port Coquitlam and what New West is doing is Port Coquitlam, if you buy a building now and you go reposition the tenants, you're at your expense now to reposition those tenants. And those tenants now have the right to come back at the same price they were paying before.
Mm-hmm.
So from a landlord perspective, so if
Why
the
would
tenants
you
there,
invest?
yeah, there's no motivation for me. And I think
Yeah.
what you're going to see is you're going to see places like Poco and New West, maybe have some older dwellings. As those buildings continue to get older, or those people in those buildings no longer are there and the tenancy turns over, there's no motivation for anyone to buy the building and fix it up,
Yeah.
right? Because I'm going to pay $6 million for it or $4 million. I'm going to spend another $2 million and I'm making a 1% return. I'll just let my money sit in T-bills,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, all this stuff combined, I think, is going to create problematics in the next short to medium term that we'll see in 2 to 3 years down the road if we don't figure it out sooner.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll get some feedback on this topic because there's a lot of people that rent and there's a lot of people that watch the show that I'm sure own property. So
Yeah.
Or
we'd like
looking to
And
acquire.
it's a balance, right? Like, you have
Yeah.
to be sympathetic to the renters. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
of course.
Because what's happened is, people have been in these condos, say, and they're paying $600-$800 for a 2-bedroom, which is now maybe $2,200.
Yeah.
And when they get dispositioned, they're not moving down the street; they're moving to Chilliwack or they're moving out of province, right?
Yeah.
So
and not necessarily moving their jobs and
exactly.
But there's ways to do it. Like you
Yeah.
said, like you could
Yeah.
tier it over 3 years and then phase
Yeah.
it out. So now there's time for the developers to
Yeah.
attract the money. So now in
Yeah.
3 years there is more
and
on
in
the
the
market.
province, when you need municipalities, they need inventory.
Yeah.
You mean a lot of municipalities have gotten very greedy, and by that I mean there's been a whole lot of interest, and developers have bought in, and there's a whole bunch of things like CACs and DCC fees and all that are paid to the cities as part of your development application process. And when you're buying a condo for $900, there's a good chance maybe $100 of that $900 is paid to the city,
Mhm.
right? So don't kid yourself, they're making a lot of money. But
Yeah.
what happens is when they get really greedy and they get a lot of people buy land and they start increasing all these costs, I mean, developers don't want to build, right?
Yeah.
And I think from a city standpoint, if you need density and you need rentals, you need to look at, maybe you're not filling the coffers in the short term like you could, but let's get housing in the city, which will then eventually will create long-term stability, because when people come, jobs are created. When jobs are created, all that stuff sort of blossoms around
Yeah.
it, right?
Yeah.
So, I think a lot of these municipalities that are sort of looking at these 4-year windows of how much can we do in a 4-year before the next election, you really got to sort of create maybe a provincial or maybe even a federal type of system in place to help build these communities, but also create enough revenue for this private sector money to invest.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think it just creates a problem for all of us down the road, or we're all paying overpriced condo prices, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we all know about that.
Yeah.
Cory, thanks for coming on the show.
pleasure. Thanks for
Yeah,
having
we
me.
appreciate it.
I
I hope
appreciate
you
it.
hope you
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
I did. I loved it.
We're gonna do a quick sign off here.
Okay.
Yeah, Gowdy, where can people follow us around online? Please don't show up at our condo.
Yeah, don't not at our own houses.
I was thinking about that this morning for like celebrities. That must just be like that. Just
Please don't do that.
someone drove. Saw a news. I don't know why I was looking at that, but I saw a thing that someone like drove through Taylor Swift's gate or something
Oh,
like that.
boy.
It's crazy stuff.
Okay, so no, you can follow us on social media.
I just gave someone an idea.
No, yeah, absolutely. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Crownsman Partners. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, at Crownsman P. We also have a Facebook group, the Crownsman Podcast. Please join. We've got like contests and giveaways
Yep.
and all our episodes, which are every Friday.
And highlights from the shows
yes,
and like all that sort of
highlights,
stuff. Yeah.
all that kind of thing. And remember, it's an episode a week. Every Friday, film, launch,
Yep.
all on one day.
Yep.
You can also listen to us if you don't want to watch us. It's not your thing. You can listen to us
So much
on
attitude today.
on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Breaker, Castbox, pretty much everywhere.
Pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching, everybody. We will see you on the next episode. And for time's sake, I'm not going to unpackage, but you want to follow the next episode because we're going to get into some environmental enforcement stuff. So it's going to be a great place for debate and opinions, and please join us.